right, welcome again to Maximizing Impact and Equity with Innovative Policy Strategies. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'll let you guys know quickly off the top here that we are recording today's webinar. We'll be sharing that recording as well as the slides with you in an email follow-up early next week. You can use the Q&A function on your Zoom window to answer any or ask any questions rather to our panelists all throughout the webinar, but we will be answering those in a Q&A session towards the end of the presentation. But again, feel free to answer those anytime throughout, or excuse me, submit those anytime throughout. I'm going to turn it over now to Sydney Roberts, who is our Director of Market and Technology Solutions here at SIA. Take it away, Sydney.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and thanks to all of you for joining us on this Friday for this really important and also very timely topic. We couldn't be more thrilled to have you with us and also to partner with ILLUME, a SIA member, for this discussion. I'm going to start by introducing our speakers today, but I also want to have a better sense of who you are, who's joining us today on this webinar. So Sarah is going to put a question in the chat. It's going to be a link to a Slido question asking you to identify from which industry you're coming, and then that'll give us a sense of who we're talking to today, and help us craft some of our answers to be most reflective and most responsive to y'all. So, yep, there we go. I see it popped up in the chat. So, and we'll share those answers with you in just a few seconds. So please go ahead and do that, and I will continue on. Let's see. So Sarah, I am not having luck advancing this slide. There we go. Thank you. So as Sarah mentioned, I am the Director of Technology and Market Solutions at SIA. As I also mentioned, you're not going to hear much from me today, but you are going to hear from three industry experts from ILLUME, Dr. Alex Dunn, Leigh Michael, and Pace Goodman. Alex is going to kick us off. She's a cognitive psychologist and a linguist who channels her quest to understand human behavior into providing insightful energy research findings. Then Leigh Michael, who is director at ILLUME, specializes in customer research and program evaluation. She's particularly interested in helping her clients understand and act upon their stakeholders' unmet needs. And Pace Goodman is going to back cleanup. He's an engineer, like I am, and has 10 years of experience in the energy utility space, using data science, engineering, and applied mathematics to facilitate and strengthen demand-side management programs. So you're going to hear a lot more from them, and they're going to speak from their specific areas of expertise and experience. I want to tell you just a tiny bit about SIA if you don't know us very well, or if you need a refresher. SIA is a regional energy efficiency organization. We work across the Southeast, the 11 states in the Southeast, and 5 island territories, and in Hawaii sometimes. Still waiting for my invitation to visit Hawaii. I assume that's coming real soon. But our goal really is to optimize the use and impact of energy to enhance the quality of life in the Southeast. Our work is very human-centered, people-centered, community-centered. And I think you'll see an alignment with the work that ILLUME does throughout this conversation. Feel free to follow up with me or with any SIA colleague if you have any questions about our work. Although ILLUME works across the United States and internationally, I wanted to give a little Southeast context before handing it off to Alex. In the South, if you look at the map on your left, this is a map that shows the percentage of households who are energy insecure by state, with the more red colors indicating more energy insecure and the more green colors indicating less energy insecure. And you can see that there's a clear trend. The South in general, and especially the Southeast, is characterized by more households who are energy insecure. And these are families who have to make choices on a month-to-month basis about where they're going to spend their precious dollars. Is it on paying their utility bills or going to the grocery or doing something else that meets a very basic need? On the right, we see a map on primary heating fuel types in the United States. So we're going to talk some about electrification today, but you can see, as indicated by the red, that the Southeast is, in general, more electrified already than most of the country. So we can talk through what that means. One of the things to note for the Southeast is that when we talk about electrified heat, we're not necessarily talking about heat pumps. We do have a lot of heat pumps, but we also have a lot of electric furnaces, which are a top priority for energy efficiency upgrades. So I look forward to a more in-depth discussion of how the experience and the expertise of ILLUME can be applied to the Southeast, and also examples from across the United States. So I want to ask Sarah if she can bring up the results from our Slido poll and show us who's with us today on this webinar.
Yep, give me just a few seconds here. All right, there you go.
Okay, wow, that's a really great mix. Everything from manufacturers, utilities, nonprofits, consulting, all across the board. So terrific. Thank you all for participating in that. And with that information, I want to pass the baton and slide control to Dr. Alex Dunn.
Thank you, Sydney. If you can go to the next slide. I wanted to introduce us. We got a quick introduction, but for the agenda, we've kind of divided this in multiple, I think, critical areas of how to kind of move from policy into actual programs and implementation while avoiding pitfalls and also making sure that equity is kind of a fundamental layer throughout the program designs from policy. So today I'll be talking about integrating stakeholders within that process. Leigh will talk about customer barriers and how to integrate that information. And then Pace is going to talk about avoiding pitfalls and really get into some of the data fun parts as well. So next slide. So I kind of wanted to start with where we've worked with some clients who've been like, okay, so we have this new legislation and now what do we do? You don't have to read the thing on the right. This is actually an extract from the CLCPA legislation in New York State. And we were asked by New York State to help them integrate EJ advocates, environmental justice advocates into the process, create a working group, and help them define disadvantaged communities so that they can then fund those communities with 40% of the clean energy funding in the state. And that's a lot. So kind of what we wanted to talk about today was this. I'm using New York as an example because everything's public, but we have done this both in the Southeast a bit, Southwest a bit, in California, and then the Pacific Northwest as well. So just know that this is translatable, I think, throughout. The ideas here are really just best practices on how to integrate stakeholders into this process. So next slide, please. here are the first steps. So you've got the legislation, and one of the nice things about the New York work was that you had established in the legislation to create a working group. But regardless of whether that's established in the legislation or not, in the creation of moving from policy into an actual something implementable, establishing a working group is really, really paramount. So including members of EJ advocates or members of the community is pretty much I think with anything related to equity, it has to happen. It's a go, no go situation in this case. And then you need to work together to set a vision. So you have the legislation, but people interpret things differently and have different perspectives on what the language means or not. And that really means that within that working group, once you've established it, you've kind of set some goals, you have to set a vision to work together toward. And if you don't, from the very beginning, what I found is that you can get closer to the end of making a decision and it unravels. But if everyone's working toward the goal that they've all agreed upon, the group will tend to, even with disagreements, find a way to, find a mutually agreed upon kind of final state, recognizing that nothing is perfect, but it's a good thing to set the vision. Excuse me. The last part of the first steps, I think, within this whole very first start of working group kind of components is to ensure that the moderator is neutral. This was something that was in New York State, something we were able to do and was, I think, a very risky and also generous thing to have. We were allowed to sit as a neutral moderator and kind of do the analysis for the working group. And that meant that we had the trust of the environmental justice advocates on the group and also the state agencies. And we could work with both parties. That allowed us, for everyone to kind of work through conflicts with moderation there that they knew they could trust. And that was pretty vital. And I think not always something that happens within our state where you hire a consultant. We were funded by the agencies to do this, but they gave us the chance to be neutral. And there were a couple times where I had to use that card and say, hey, I want to be neutral in this. I need to be to get this done. And it really, really made a difference. So wherever possible, establish the working group, make sure community members are at least half of the group. So you have kind of a solid balance, set the vision together, and then have a neutral moderator. Next slide. The other part of this is, in addition to having a neutral moderator, is to really pull in experts and provide specific recommendations based on the knowledge that the experts give you during different working group meetings. It's really important to have the people who have been researching and working on this for a long time come in and give their opinions and thought. And it helps to create kind of an even playing ground of knowledge for everyone in the working group, which you really need. A good expert who can come in and provide solid recommendations in a easily understandable way allows the decision makers, those on the working group, to be able to make those decisions, right? And feel comfortable and confident making those decisions. Without that, there's a lot of questions about, well, I don't understand the data, so I don't know how to act or what to do and what's in the best interest of my community. And it's just really, really vital to spend the time doing some of the data-driven components and also provide, a foundation of education so everyone is feeling very confident there. Now, I want to kind of have a couple of things to keep in mind here, which is, keep things in the public forum and presentations, but provide those documents to the working group beforehand as much as possible or afterward, and allow for extra meetings to deliberate and discuss and go through things. Both in New York State, but then also in some of the other areas that we've done this work, we've had the big public presentations with experts. And then we've also had smaller meetings with individual people who, on the working group, who had questions about a specific technical component. And so then we'd go through that and kind of go through some various, statistical minutia so that they could feel comfortable and confident making the decisions they need to make. The final one, which I think is kind of really very vital, but often not thought of as much, as using visuals in these complex conversations. And ones with live data changes, I think, are pretty vital here too. Again, you're asking people who within a working group to make some critical decisions on things that there's no way that they can become an expert on, but you need to be able to visualize and explain and provide proof on hand immediately. If you make this one change, how is it going to look on a map, or how is it going to look with the data that and that makes a big difference to be able to continue the conversation down the line. Next slide, please. Here's an example of that. This is again for New York, and what we were trying to do was identify how to integrate a bunch of different data and create disadvantaged community definition for the state of New York. And to do that, we had to look at various different, do we include this do we include low birth weight as an indicator, or do we include, zoning of industrial zones into the indicator? And then how do we combine those? And one of the things that we ended up doing was using maps like these often, where on a separate page we could toggle different indicators or different ways of combining indicators, and then we could compare the two different scenarios. And so we would color this, and people could zoom into their neighborhood and take a look and say, hey, the red one looks right to me, but the blue and the yellow are totally off. Or in this case is like, well, the yellow and the red look right to me, but the blue is not right. And through that process, and it was very iterative, we were starting to get a sense of what was really a definition that fit the ground truth experience of those EJ advocates and the community, the folks within the community. So it was a really big and important tool to have. And while I know this is specific to disadvantaged communities in this sense, I think one of the things that's worth noting here is you can do this with many different types of data. And for someone who doesn't spend their life in data, it's really nice to have a visual that then can change if you make a difference, because then people can get an intuitive view or feeling for, if I change this one little thing, this bar goes up or this bar goes down. And that can make a big, big difference in letting someone feel comfortable about making a decision that has pretty big policy implications further down the road. Next slide. I think this is my final slide, and I just wanted to go through, I'd mentioned this, but I think to do this right, especially when we're talking about specific equity-related, energy-related policy work that we're doing these days especially, it's vital to create a public forum. The New York State process was public, and others have been more private. And I would say that the public policy, the public area is really important for transparency. It keeps and maintains trust for everyone around the groups. It allows for the general public to create comments down the line of further ones, but everything's there and open and pretty darn important to have, especially when talking about some of these big, big decisions. Coupled with that, I think it's also really important that through this process, when you're talking about some really big decisions and a lot of technical nuances there, going and allowing for private, smaller discussion within the different, working group members is really pretty vital as well, because there's times when, working group members just need some time to figure out what they're thinking, what they're doing, or they're very concerned about something, and they want to be able to have those discussions privately. If that happens, I think it's important to summarize when those happened and, kind of what the general discussion topics were about, so that the public is also aware of that. This, I think, is one of those areas where later down the road, it might be hard to create a public process and have to integrate meetings and all the things that come along with this. But down the road, when you're implementing something from legislation, it allows for the public and also any future kind of, say, lawsuits that could happen to have a very well documented approach of how one arrived from initial legislation interpretation all the way to the decisions that you've made to implement it. Without that public process, that is much, much harder to do. So I think that's it for me. Next slide. And Leigh, I'll hand it to you.
Lovely. Thank you. Okay, everyone. So actually, I think I jumped the gun a little bit on advancing this slide. Okay, so now I want to spend a few minutes talking about how we can understand true customer barriers to equitable service delivery and to use that to ground developing solutions. Okay. So traditional service or program design typically focuses on designing and implementing the solution based on the problem that we think we're trying to solve, and then evaluating the program and refining it. So maybe this flow chart looks familiar to some people who have been involved in program design or on the implementation and evaluation side. But when we're trying to advance equity while developing new services and solutions, we need to really rethink this order. So we need to start with thinking about what inequities are we trying to solve and for whom, and then why. And these questions can really only be answered or informed by the people who are experiencing those inequities. So what you see here is kind of a different process, and it's one that's iterative, but it starts always with listening. So listening is grounded in the whole process. So if we can't understand the inequities that might be preventing equal benefits to everyone, we need to step back, learn from, and listen to communities who have actually lived in those experiences. So when we center these communities, and that includes, businesses, that includes individuals, the what we're trying to address, that might change, right? And this represents a real shift in our industry, is adopting this iterative process that's really grounded in what we heard, not what we think we heard or what we think we're trying to solve. So I want to provide a couple of examples of how this has played out for two different clients that we've worked with. Like Alex mentioned, I selected both of these projects because they're publicly available. There are lots of examples of entities across the country who have also done this kind of work. But the first here is ComEd on the left-hand side, which is a utility based in Illinois. And we conducted 26 interviews with community-based organizations that represented a bunch of different community dimensions within their service territory. In New York State, we took a bit of a different approach. We did 8 focus groups that included individuals, business owners, and nonprofit staff. And we also had 2 public hearings. So what I'm really trying to get at here is that the methods that you take to gather these perspectives might be different, but the real goal is to get people in the room who maybe have not been involved in these decision-making processes before, or who have not had a voice in these processes in the past. Okay, so how to understand what barriers exist and then how to address them. So the first is really about listening. And like I mentioned on the prior slide, this can take place by focus groups. It could be in-depth interviews. It could be listening sessions. It could even be on-site intercepts, or sometimes we've done like door-by-door stops and had quick conversations with people. So there are lots of different ways that you can, seek to understand the perspectives of people. But I really want to highlight that these sessions were not were not just centered around conversations related to energy or energy services. We sought to understand the realities and challenges of people's lived experiences, which really means zooming out from just energy, because, you know, energy is something that most people, especially folks who may be facing inequities, have not spent a lot of time thinking about. It's not something that controls a lot of their headspace. So we really wanted to understand the more holistic barriers, challenges, and opportunities that these customers face. So then we start with listening, and then we work to articulate barriers from that listening. And we usually, you know, broke these kind of into different themes. So related around like historic barriers or structural barriers, or understanding affordability barriers, or community perspectives and trust. So, you know, trying to organize what we heard into common themes that are being experienced across communities. And then one thing that I think is a really important part of this process to acknowledge is identifying constraints. So understanding what is within the power of the, or sphere of influence of the entity to control, and what is not. So, you know, an example is with ComEd, which is a utility. There were some, you know, customer issues that we were hearing about that are really regulatory issues, right? So the utility does not have the power to address them directly, but perhaps could advocate to you know, make regulatory changes. And then from that is creating recommendations. And I think of recommendations as the strategy. So it's kind of the zoomed out bird's eye view of what needs to happen or where we need to go. And then from there, we also identified potential opportunities. And I think of those as the tactics. So that's if you're zooming in, here are the specific things that you could do to try to address it. And I'm going to walk us through an example on the next couple of slides. Okay, so I'm going to drop in the chat a link to this report actually after I finish my section, but I wanted to just extract one of the examples of barriers and then recommendations and opportunities that we did when we were working with ComEd. So after conducting those interviews with community-based organizations who again represented communities across ComEd's service territory, one barrier that we identified was related to community perspectives and trust. So, you know, we heard that customers in docks or disadvantaged communities may perceive limited benefits or value of the programs that ComEd offers. This probably is not surprising to everyone, right? Like, we understand that there is a utility customer trust issue. But what we understood when we dug a little bit deeper is that customers who live in disadvantaged communities or docks had critical concerns related to mobility, so getting to school and work safely. They had issues related to housing safety. So they had, you know, old or outdated housing stock and issues within their home. And then just general public safety. So, you know, in ComEd service territory, they have those super, super cold winters and those really, really hot summers. So they're concerned about those things, right? They're not concerned about the latest energy efficiency program or something like that. So we developed this recommendation, which is on the left-hand side of this screen, which is that ComEd should explore programs and services that provide direct value to customers in docks. Again, high level, this feels pretty obvious, right? Like, we want to center the needs of customers in program design. I think that, you know, when we're thinking about electrification, for example, there are some obvious opportunities to address this. So, you know, could provide, for example, EV tax credits or public charging stations in docks. If we're looking at vehicle electrification, we could bolster weatherization or home rehabilitation programs to increase health, safety, and durability of homes. But we really sought to like dig in here a little bit more to think about opportunities that might not be as obvious. So one was around, you know, one thing that we heard was significant concerns within disadvantaged communities around their air quality, and that there were high cases of asthma within their communities. And so an opportunity that we identified was around providing a supplemental tax credit to medium and heavyweight vehicles that are around ports, warehouses sited near disadvantaged communities to hopefully increase air quality. Another thing that we heard was that people tend to turn off their central heating during the winter, and they use space heaters instead as an effort to save money. So that ComEd could target a program in addition to their winter shutoff that helps, address these things. So really just trying again to look at the less obvious dimensions of how to support customers at, addressing the things that are really top of mind and critical to them. So I think this is my last slide. And if you were to leave this little section with one thing, it's to step back and listen to underserved communities before articulating the problems, and then to design solutions that are informed or grounded by what you heard there. And I also just want to highlight the importance of transparency wherever possible. So, I really appreciated that both ComEd and New York made these reports publicly available so that the public could see the impacts of their input being incorporated into, how they're designing new programs and solutions. Okay, Pace, I'm going to turn it on to you.
All right, sorry. Took me a second to figure out how to come off mute. All right, so Alex and Leigh talked about putting these policies together, what that might look like in terms of designing a program. I'm going to be a little bit downstream from that. I'm going to talk about sharing some specific insights for how these kind of programs and how these policies have taken shape in practice. I'm also going to try to then zoom back out and talk about how general policy practices could have helped mitigate some of the challenges that we've experienced in the examples that I've been a part of. But I think that kind of zoom out would also apply to other general policies and programs with that are similar. So also a fair warning, I'm an engineer and a math person, so I might, my presentation just might come from that perspective a little bit. Alrighty, so the example that I want to talk about is electrifying space heating in disadvantaged communities. This is a very important policy priority in many states. As others discuss, policy, at least from my perspective, policy kind of comes out, stakeholders get together, they define some of the details, the goals of the policy, what the program might look like, what are some of the components the program would have to navigate in order to achieve its goals. And so we laid out some specific examples that we're seeing for different policies and some of the specifics. So, which funding channels you can use to fund which initiatives, what some of the participation targets might be, et cetera. Those are some of the pieces that we see that the programs ultimately have to navigate. So these programs are created, as Leigh described, that program and service design piece, and they have to navigate these different requirements and also achieve the goals that get laid out. Various entities may be responsible for kind of that program, service, and design piece for standing up and then operating those programs. Could be state agencies, maybe it's utilities, just depends on the situation, really. And then one specific anecdote that I want to share that I didn't get a chance to put in the slides here, but I do think is really important. There is certain situations where we've seen programs be able to start to prepare themselves for future policy coming. So in one state, it was becoming clear that electrification policy may be coming out in the next 3 years, something like that. They were starting to get a sense that the commission and other entities were really interested in electrification. So they were able to start to put some pieces together. They were able to kind of figure out internal alignment in terms of the language they were using around electrification, what working group they wanted to be a part of, both within the state and then regionally. They were able to figure out different initiatives that they could support within their existing program rules that would help set them up. So for example, for space heating, as Sydney brought up, electric resistance heating is a great opportunity for traditional efficiency, right? You can just install a heat pump where you have an electric resistant furnace. That's going to help the customer. You're going to have energy efficiency savings. So they're able to push some of that forward. That gives an opportunity to, train the workforce, get them familiar with the technology, and honestly, even just starting to see how that different equipment is performing in the field. It was a great opportunity for that program to set themselves up for future policy, so that when that policy came in, they already had some pieces in place, some internal alignment, and were able to respond, I think, a little bit more quickly. Not to say there weren't challenges, there always are, but anyway, I just want to kind of highlight that one anecdote I didn't get to put in my slides here. So this is the example we're going to dive into. All right, so prioritizing electrification for DAC is with really, really good reasoning. Some of the things that I often hear is that we want to ensure access to innovative technologies and the associated benefits for these communities. So the clearest example, or the thing I've heard the most, is with electric vehicles, right? If we don't have electric vehicle charging in these communities, they're just going to have less access to that technology. It's going to be a barrier for them. They're not going to get those local air quality benefits that Leigh was talking about. Similarly, we don't want the financial responsibility of maintaining natural gas infrastructure to fall on only those folks who cannot afford to convert their homes to all electric. So if you can imagine, 75% of customers are able to electrify their appliances. This program is just doing so great. It electrifies all those customers. Some folks believe that the kind of fixed cost of maintaining that natural gas infrastructure is then just going to really raise prices for those customers who are not able to who cannot afford to electrify their appliances. So these are two of the really, really good reasons we hear for why this is a priority. And so I want to make clear that those are really good reasons. I'm also going to talk about some of the unintended consequences that we're seeing, and that I want to put on people's radar, and I think it's really important to kind of keep an eye out for, if that makes sense. All right, so here's a graph. It's going to get very detailed. I probably won't go into all of the details, but the biggest unintended consequence I wanted to talk about was bill impacts for electrifying space heating. So the customer bill impacts can really pose a challenge for electrifying space heating. Basically, natural gas is often cheaper than electric energy per unit of energy. Heat pumps are more efficient than furnaces. But so there's a little bit of a counterbalance here. And so you can see that in the graphs, and I'm not going to cover the graph in detail right now, but if there are some more specific questions, we can come back to it. But the main point is that natural gas is often cheaper than electric energy per unit of energy, which can create some challenging dynamics for bill impacts. Bill impacts can also vary throughout the year. So as you can see on the graph on the right, you might install a heat pump, customer saves energy during the summer, but now their costs are more expensive in the wintertime. And that change in cash flow can be unexpected for customers. And if you're, living month to month, that just maybe too big of a challenge for you. And then the last piece about bill impacts I wanted to make sure to highlight was that there really can be a range of bill impact outcomes, even within a given program. The rates for certain customers might be slightly different depending if you have electric utility, but different gas utilities for that electric utility, there might be a range of gas prices that customers within a program are experiencing. So that can really affect the bill impact outcomes. Natural gas prices are pretty volatile. They've been pretty volatile this past year. So that can, again, how you're thinking about that can really impact the bill impacts, as well as price forecast, right? What do we think the future of natural gas prices is going to be? Obviously, you can imagine there's a wide range of prices that people expect. And then lastly, heat pump system performance is also pretty variable. So you might get a lot of different bill impact outcomes just based on the way people are operating heat pump systems and how they were installed. So you might have a range of bill impact outcomes even within a program. It might benefit some customers, but not all. And so that's a challenge to be aware of. It's also an opportunity because all of these pieces give some flexibility to a program to help ensure that the bill impacts are as positive for customers as they can be. So as you can imagine, the program could help customers be on rates. So if you convert to a heat pump, you can help customers be on electric rates that are cheaper typically than non-space heating electric rates and things like that. So it's a challenge for the range of outcomes, but also potentially a bit of an opportunity. The other intended consequences that I will just very lightly touch on, but these are really important, is installation costs. In several places, we're seeing the installation costs for income eligible type programs for electrification for whole home to be really high, much higher than expected, and growing as the program matures, which is also unexpected. So there are some challenges for this installation cost. And one question that comes up a lot is what other good could you do with this money? Is this the best use of those dollars? So that's what I wanted to highlight. I also want to highlight there's a little bit of a disconnect for DAC customers. They may not be aware of electrification, and they may not see much value for them. If the value proposition is you may not have bill impacts go up, that's just maybe not the most exciting sales pitch. So there can be a bit of a disconnect for customers. And then lastly, electrification may require additional grid investments in certain places, and that can pose another unintended challenge. I think there was one multifamily building for one client we were working with that fully electrifying that multifamily building would have required an update upstream on the grid, which delayed the electrification project, obviously created some challenges. So definitely something to be aware of. Hopefully programs are starting to talk to the grid teams a little bit more. All right, so I'm closing my in practice piece up. So I'm taking a bit of a zoom out, right? So we were talking about specifically space heating for DAC, and now I want to, this is kind of a zoom out. These are things that I think are true to help mitigate some of the challenges we're seeing for electrifying space heating that I also think can apply to all sorts of different types of policies in this space. So one, I want to make sure folks test the policy in practice. Don't expect to go to scale right away. Or if you do, just know you're going to run into barriers. So be ready to be able to pivot and have some flexibility in the program design. So, but ideally just test some things in practice first. Be comprehensive, but expect you may not have thought of everything. So even if you're being really thoughtful in the delivery, as Alex was talking about, including all these different perspectives, there's still a chance you're still probably not going to think of everything. There's going to be something that comes up you didn't think of. So, that's not a problem. We're going to hit road bumps. We're trying to do a lot of change. That's okay. We just need to be ready to solve them as quickly as we can. Make sure to have research and evaluation teams well set up to support these programs. I think those two really are well connected. And lastly, don't wait, right? I'm talking about unintended consequences, but I think doing nothing is also really an unacceptable outcome. So we're going to try things. We're going to hit road bumps. That's okay. We just need to be prepared to pivot. So I am going a little bit over time. All right, so that closed my slides. I want to touch back lightly on each of the three speakers, Alex, Leigh, and myself, just to remind folks what we talked about. Alex talked about including different perspectives. So kind of a one-sentence reminder is integrate those energy justice advocates into the process, make it open, engage often, and have a neutral moderator. Leigh talked about the customer side of things, so take time to listen to impacted communities before you begin to design solutions. And then a little bit downstream, from my perspective, I just wanted to say, don't wait, but test program designs and be prepared to address real challenges while programs are operating. All right, and that closes things for what we wanted to present. So I think we're going to go to Q&A.
Thank you, Pace, and thank all of you. That was really terrific. I know my head is buzzing. I've got a number of questions. I see one that has been entered in the Q&A. So if y'all have additional questions, please put them into the Q&A and I can get them to our presenters. I want to start off with a question that is kind of central to who we are at SEIA. We are an energy efficiency alliance. So how do we talked about some electrification examples, which are really top of mind, I think, now for a lot of us in the industry. But how do we incorporate some kind of adjacent solutions like weatherization, traditional energy efficiency, maybe demand response, demand flexibility into our program planning, and might including these lead to more equitable outcomes?
Alex, you look like you're about to talk, so maybe I'll let you go and then I can follow.
Okay, I can say really quickly that I think that programs are going to have to move from a traditional, here's a widget, here's an incentive, here's, go do this. Or with low income programs, you have weatherization, that's it. I think what we need to start thinking about programs and the way we design them is more like a recipe. Here are the different ingredients we have. What's the best recipe to fit your home? And that means then that I think to Pace's point, some of those installation costs are actually addressing some known issues, both health and safety, but then also, you want to get your insulation up to snuff before you put in a heat pump so that you're sizing it right, and all these different things. And I think it's really moving toward a policy framework that allows utilities to have that recipe kind of design, as opposed to here's my HVAC program, here's my, well, we don't have lighting much anymore, but you know what I mean, those different programs. So, Pace?
That was all really great points. I wanted to call out one specific example that we're seeing is readiness programs. So you might have a weatherization program that is also starting to give these customers the proper amperage of service, right? So a heat pump might require that electric resistance backup, which then requires potentially a new panel, some rewiring, and then going from 100 amp service to 200 amp service. And so those programs are not cheap, but those programs, we are seeing examples of those programs. That's one kind of immediate thing that came up to me. The other is we are working with different programs to figure out metrics to compare those different benefits. Again, this goes back to what are you trying to achieve with that policy? What are different perspectives? How can you compare these things to be apples to apples? So I think in California, they're starting to compare some of these different initiatives by specific requirements around the grid impacts, but then also specific requirements around the greenhouse gas impacts. And those might be different metrics. And then they have energy efficiency goals as well. So it's a little bit of a challenge. I'm not gonna say that's going very well for them in all places, but that is one way that they are trying to handle those, by having specific metrics tied to those kind of disparate initiatives. So yeah, defining those metrics up front with stakeholders can be really helpful.
Thank you. I love that analogy of the recipe. Leigh, did you have?
I have a lightning fast thing to add.
Yeah.
Is that, I also think that utilities should not be expected. They can't do it all, right? Like there are some things that are within the sphere of what they can do, and there are some things that they cannot. So what I think has been really cool to see across the country is utilities forming partnerships, whether that's formal or informal, with other organizations and entities, say in housing or transportation, who do have maybe more resources or control to provide that kind of support. And I think that that's also really going to, go up into supporting utilities electrification goals, is by, seeking help from other partners who can help address critical things as well.
That's all really great input. I'd like to pull on that thread about more flexible or kind of allowing more creativity on the policy side for utilities. What are some, I don't know, ideas or examples of how that could happen, or where it may actually be happening? And how to you showed, Alex, some jargon, mumbo jumbo policy, and then translating that into action. What are some ways that we can, as an industry, kind of put things in place to avoid unintended consequences, not just for the communities, but also for the grid and for our other partners in the industry?
I will respond first, I'll respond first, and let other people kind of add on. I think one thing we've seen for flexibility is ongoing communication. So we talked about in bringing these perspectives in as you're setting policy up, but then having some sort of recurring way or ongoing way to be communicating with these different groups is really helpful. So where we're seeing bill impacts seeing unexpected challenges for bill impacts in certain places. Ongoing communication between the program and the policy teams are enabling targets to be hit where those programs are not the most cost-effective offering in the portfolio, right? But they're going to hit those targets and drive that forward, and they're working with entities to figure out how to navigate where those bill impacts are just not as positive as they were hoping they would be. And anyway, so that ongoing communication is I think really helpful.
I think it's a doozy of a question in that like you're kind of asking us like, well, how far do we go in changing the whole framework is my interpretation of that. And I would say that where I see the most movement is from regional entities, like larger geographic areas. And then they include then different utilities that are also working within that space, and they get a little bit more bandwidth or leeway with regulators to be creative about kind of integrating multiple agencies and stakeholders, frankly. The New York example, the voting agencies that were there were, you know, the Department of Health, the you know, environmental climate kind of groups, but then there was also, you know, very specific talking about housing and zoning and all these different areas that mattered for. The utilities were less present, but probably should have been more present, right? So I think that my short answer is I think regional work is really important, but I also think that regulators and utilities in a regulated space need to work creatively and kind of give some bandwidth. So like work in tandem very carefully. Did you lose me? You all froze for a second. Sorry.
No, gotcha.
So just, I think, okay, regulators and utilities, I think it should work together closely and try to give a little leeway at certain places to allow for some of these you know, cross-program, cross-policy, cross-agency work.
Thank you. That's really helpful, and it relates to a question that that Vince Fuentes from Daikin put into the Q&A. He addressed it to Leigh, but I think it really applies to everyone, and I'm kind of going to paraphrase. He's asking about the DACs, the individuals and community-based organizations in the DACs, and the needs that they have and that they express. And the way that I'm interpreting his question, and he'll correct me if I'm wrong, is how are those needs best articulated, and might we achieve greater success if we create mechanisms for those needs to kind of be bubbled up from the bottom rather than relying on utilities and others basically in positions of power to kind of go out and, you know, be top down rather than bottom up?
Yeah, so and Vince, I interpreted the question as understanding if rather than always these policies coming from the state down, whether utilities are kind of taking the initiative to understand the needs of customers maybe before a policy is in place. And I think there are some utilities who are really taking initiative around that. I mean, ComEd is a great example of a utility who really sought to understand customer barriers, and this was really tied to their electrification strategy. So the timing of it was kind of as they are thinking about their next, you know, how they're going to be using their investments and shaping their strategy in the coming years. There's also a utility that comes to mind in the Seattle area, which is where I live, that we've been working with, who is developing their clean energy implementation plan that's really grounded in having direct input from representatives of disadvantaged communities. And rather than just having like one interview effort where they talk to them, they have these working groups, which is kind of like to Alex's point of really engaging communities throughout the process, because needs change over time, or as knowledge grows, you know, people I think might have different perspectives of how utilities can best support them. So I think that there are cool things happening on that front. I also do think that it's a little crunchy when still, you know, the primary mechanism for measuring the success of programs is around a cost benefit analysis, and equitable service does not always fit or add up into that. So I think we are in like a weird inflection point where we're still kind of figuring out how to reckon with that.
That is all so well said. The only like little piece I kind of want to add is a lot of programs in the country are seeing electrification uptake in their non-income eligible programs do really well. They're seeing a lot of excitement. Folks are going out, they're buying that equipment. And if you think about it as, you know, emissions is pollution, that's what an amazing thing. Some of the people who might be the greatest polluters are going out and fixing it themselves, like with a little bit of help from the programs. Like that's fantastic. Whereas these programs that are really trying to help the DAC, because I mean the C word there, those programs are very expensive, and you're asking the most vulnerable population to be the ones who are reducing their pollution, and that there's a little bit there's a lot of contention there. So I think some of that does start to really point to what Alex was talking about, where there's disagreement. How do you facilitate those conversations between folks? Because there's a lot of competing priorities, and there is conflict between cost effectiveness, making sure that DAC aren't left behind for this electrification movement, but also, you know, not putting them in a situation where you're adding to their bills when you have market rate programs that are doing well.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think we're getting close to time. This has been terrific. I know there are a couple more questions left in the chat, but we're going to have to call it for today. I think Sarah has a few parting words, and Alex has got to pet her cat. So let's pass it back to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Sydney, and thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm going to pop a link real quick for everybody. If you can, very quick survey. It's literally just like 3-4 questions about how we did today. We would be so appreciative. That helps us make these webinars better for you in the future. If you want to get in on the action of being a SEIA member or sponsoring events, please check us out at sealliance.org/membership. You can also sign up to receive news and announcements at seealliance.org/updates. We promise to keep it brief and meaningful. We won't spam you. And then last but certainly not least, a very special thank you to our friends and partners at ILLUME, who put together this great presentation for us and made it possible. So thank you so much. We're so glad that you guys are here with us this morning. Have a great rest of your Friday and a great weekend, and happy holidays to all.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks all. Bye-bye.
Bye all. Thanks.